Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Tonight we have a late night insight video on a Francesca Bianchi fragrance. I've been running through the house and I've got more decants too. So a house that I own almost no bottles and I only have one bottle from the house, but I've got a ton of decants. So it's a house I've been diving into lately, and this is maybe one of her most popular fragrances. It's called Sticky Fingers. Now, you can see I've got a sample, which I put a pretty damn good dent in, and I also have a second sample somebody sent me long ago. And to whoever my perfume god person who sent me this long ago, thank you very much. Anytime I get two samples of the same fragrance, I know it's time to do a review, mostly because two people thought it was worth sending it to me. And the second thing is it clears up more space on my shelf, which is continuously filling up with more samples, thanks to the generosity of the community, really. I never buy samples, which I'm not saying like, oh, I'm some big shot, I never buy samples. I'm saying I'm very blessed, thanks to the kindness of the community, that I never have to buy samples, because this is a very expensive hobby. And so the generosity of you guys allows me to get my nose on something like this, which I will probably never own a bottle. So it allows me to put my thoughts out there, right? And I've given Francesca Bianchi a hard time on some of her releases, and with good reason. I've got a playlist. You can go watch all of my thoughts on her fragrances. This fragrance actually opens up like a vintage fragrance to me, to my nose. I've worn it to bed 3 or 4 times, and every time it gives me hints of sort of vintage throwback honeyed patchouli fragrances, right? So, for example, the one that I wore just within the last couple weeks, and I'm gearing up to do a Hall of Fame review, and this will get a Hall of Fame review, is Givenchy's Gentleman. This is basically honey, patchouli, leather, castoreum, right? And that's kind of how Sticky Fingers opens up. So I must say I was shocked when I read the blurb, although her blurbs should not shock me, but here's the short and sweet of it. A sumptuous and elegant patchouli is the protagonist of this rock chic creation. A sparkling, spicy opening then reveals leather and tobacco, all infused in iris butter. It represents a wild yet carefree atmosphere, sophisticated yet sensual, elegant with originality. I doth protest, elegant with originality. I think she borrowed a lot from the vintage masculines of the past, let's say. It's not just this one. You could take Giorgio Beverly Hills for Men. There are many patchouli honey type fragrances, even a little bit of Pavarotti you can spell in here. Pavarotti from the 90s, probably one of the best, I would say, sort of, celebrity fragrances that you can think of. So I think this fragrance opens up very original for her brand, but original if you know the history of perfumery, no, not at all. However, I must admit that this sort of vintage patchouli, castoreum leather with a touch of that Francesca Bianchi modern DNA, which, if you know the sort of notes that she likes to overdose, that benzoin, irisy, ambery thing, which comes out later, and it comes out later much strong. It's almost like it comes a little bit back with a vengeance later on. But I personally think she borrowed a lot from the past. So this elegant with originality thing, you can stop that right there. Here's the actual rest of the blurb if you're interested. It says, the perfume sticks not just to your fingers, but perversely sticks to your mind. The perfume revolves around patchouli in a decadent and sumptuous interpretation. Yes, the opening of this fragrance does lean heavy on the patchouli side of things, so you do have to be a little bit of a patch lover. The opening immediately puts on the table the powerful weapons and intense, almost boozy patchouli. Yes, I'll agree with that. The opening does give a little bit of a boozy patchouli, but it's very earthy and vintage in style, okay? It's very scratchy, and it's very, well, I'm going to do a fresh spray, just because, why not? I'm reviewing the damn thing, might as well. This is going to probably go up on my shelf in case anyone in the next year or two goes, hey, Ramsey, what did you think of Sticky Fingers? And I can pull out the old sample again. But yes, it does open up with a little bit of a boozy patchouli, and it says, somehow wild and carefree, dangerously dressed in leather, but playful. The dry down gets softer and more complex. Well, what happens in the dry down is her accord that is overdosed in many of her fragrances comes out. It's a little sort of hampered in the beginning. It's pushed down, you know, like it's being held underwater and it's sort of struggling to come out, and it does come out later on. It says, makes the whole atmosphere smoother and more intriguing. Don't get fooled by Iris. No romance is going on here. We'll talk about her marketing later. Tobacco leaves are rolled and leather jacket is eventually thrown somewhere, and the delightful and tempting smell of skin finally emerges. Many intertwined reasons and personal mental associations led me to this creation and its title. This perfume is conceived to be as tempting as chocolate stuck all over your fingers, and you cannot help but licking them. Mind you, this is not a gourmand fragrance, and licking your fingers is a metaphor referring to other kind of irresistible temptations. We get it. We completely understand where you're going. I don't think you need to make it any more obvious. One major reference is surely the iconic album from 1971, I Love Rock, in the 70s for what they brought to music, but especially I love that album cover. Definitely 70s more for the fragrances, not the album cover. Okay, so enough of that, enough of the little blurb. So here is sort of how the fragrance breaks down. And again, I don't own a bottle. I've only worn this to bed 3 or 4 times, so this is sort of my interpretation very early on. But I will tell you right from the get-go that this DNA, this accord speaks to me, okay? So as hard of a time as I give Francesca Bianchi, and for good reason, I think that this is one of her best fragrances, and I see why it's hyped. I see why it's one of her most hyped fragrances. If you look up reviews on YouTube on Francesca Bianchi, this was a huge hype beast in FragCom over the last 2 or 3 years, and I'm always wary of that, right? I'm always wary of the hype beasts in FragCom because many times I disagree with a lot of the fragrances that get ultra hype, but this one is to my taste because it's sort of created with vintage fragrances in mind, especially the opening, okay? The opening really shines in that 70s style, if you will. So like I said, things like Givenchy Gentleman will come to mind. And even though there's no sort of hardcore animalics in this, it's not as animalic as some of the 70s fragrances where it really feels like sometimes you're getting real castoreum if you get vintage bottles and stuff like that, which I don't know if they're using real castoreum, but it feels like the animalics were turned up heavier on some of the vintage fragrances. The castoreum note here is pretty prominent. To her credit, she did not back away from this. I mean, she really put a heavy dose of castoreum in there, and it is sort of mixed with that patchouli, that leather, and it sort of, like I said, drowns out that very famous orris butter overdose that she uses in many of her fragrances, that ambery orris butter thing. Here, she blended it with heliotrope, and we'll talk about why that's important later on, but that tonka bean, ambery, orris butter thing is there. Actually, I get more of it in the opening from the actual branded sample than I did from the sample that my buddy sent me. The sample that my buddy sent me, I feel like I got a lot more of the patchouli and castoreum and leather right from the get-go. I'm getting a little bit more of her orris and stuff like that in the actual branded sample early on. That comes later on in the sample that was actually let to sit in the air a little bit longer. And so what's interesting, and I pointed this out over and over again, is that overdose that she uses, it doesn't just kind of make itself known, but it seems to pervade her releases. And I've called her a little bit of a lazy creator because of that, because her scents have similarity between fragrance to fragrance, but also that house DNA that she overdoses comes across as very, very similar, right? So you don't get huge differences when you buy many of her fragrances. There's big similarities between them, especially in the dry down to me. And so if you wait for it to dry down, that house DNA of hers will become more prominent as the hours go by. And so, but for me, however, like I said, no matter what I say, the bad things I'm going to say about this fragrance, I like this, okay? This is a win for me, for my taste. And I think it's probably one of the best Francesca Bianchis up there that I've tried. Now, I haven't tried them all. There's more to come. I think I got the Black Knight sitting up here waiting for one of these as well. So to my nose, the two big hits from the house are this Sticky Fingers and Under My Skin. Those are the two that really speak to me. But if you go back to Under My Skin, what's interesting is the two that are a contender for the top spot. If you go back to Under My Skin was based on a vintage composition as well. At least to me, I think it smelled a lot in the same ballpark as something like Bala Versailles, right? And so if you go back to Bala Versailles, I have a review of Bala Versailles actually on the channel if you're interested. One of the most beautiful, gorgeous bottles, that harp cap with the ladies of Versailles looking rather guilty. God knows what they were doing in the dark corners of Versailles. And just a beautiful packaging. Rumor is this was Michael Jackson's signature scent. This is discontinued. This is the Pure Parfum. And there is definitely some body, skin on skin feeling to this fragrance as well. Maybe some unbathed humans for a couple days on end. Let's put it that way. There's definitely something animalic and dirty there. And Under My Skin had a little bit of that DNA in it. And so when I think about some of her best work, and I think about the fact that this, Sticky Fingers, draws back to something like Givenchy Gentleman, and then Under My Skin, which is her other favorite, draws back to Bala Versailles, I can definitely see that my favorite fragrances from her take heavy, heavy inspiration from the past. So just something that I'm pointing out. I'm not giving her a hard time about it. Some of my favorite niche houses nowadays do that anyways, because I think the past gives a better indication of sort of where we're going in fragrance in the future anyways than the 1,000 just crap releases that they're putting out per year anyways that you have to wade through, and it's like crap, right? I'd rather go back to the past when I actually really like stuff like this. And so, but that is something that I noticed, that my two favorites from her harken heavily to vintage fragrances from the past. The other thing I'll mention is that the tobacco comes out a little bit more deeper into the dry down, which you would think this this construction that I'm mentioning, leather, castoreum, patchouli, heavy patchouli, tobacco, this is an out and out masculine release. And you know what? I think if it wasn't for her accord, her brand accord, mixed with this sort of course, that waxy, powdery iris note that she loves to use, that orris butter, blended with heliotrope. And heliotrope gives the fragrance this sort of depth, it makes it feel like Play-Doh, okay? Which is that house accord that she uses anyways, I feel like gives off some of that. Even though she doesn't list heliotrope, I think it's a main ingredient in her Francesca Bianchi Enad, or whatever you want to call it. Whatever her house DNA, just like the Guerlain, she's got the Francesca Bianchi Enad. And, I think heliotrope is a big part of that, even though she doesn't always list it. Here she does list it, okay? And so that heliotrope, I think, sort of blends with the orris butter, the iris butter, whatever you want to call it, and the powderiness. And it also, I think, mixes with this sort of waxy beeswax note. Even though there's no beeswax listed, there's definitely this waxy feel of beeswax in here. I would not be surprised if there's a honey touch. There's no honey listed in the note listing. The note listing is coriander, cinnamon, iris butter, patchouli, sandalwood, heliotrope, musk, castoreum, leather, tobacco, and tonka bean. No honey. But there's definitely a honey feel, no matter what she says. I think maybe she didn't want to make it as obvious, like a honeyed patchouli type thing. This is just one example. Again, there's many, many examples of this from the past that are made for men, that are marketed towards men. But what's interesting is that as the hours tick by, okay, the what ends up coming out, that orris irisy butter thing, starts turning slightly lipsticky. Okay, it turns slightly lipsticky, which I actually really like. But when you add the lipstick feel with the heliotrope, okay, and this sort of floral accord begins to emerge. And that floral accord is not listed. There isn't a floral note in here that's listed that speaks to the floral accord that I'm actually getting. But there's definitely some sort of a, I don't know, rose, violet. I don't know what it is, but something floral begins to come out. It could be from the iris as well, but you know, there's something floral that starts to arrive a couple hours in, okay? Whenever that hardcore patchouli leather castoreum begins to fade and more of her house accord starts to come out. And what's interesting is as more of her house accord starts to come out, and I get more of that lipsticky orris thing, okay? It almost pushes the hardcore masculine idea from the 70s and 80s out of my head. And it makes it something that, you know, smells, instead of traditionally masculine, there are little feminine touches in here, okay? Little feminine touches that make the fragrance sit unisex, which is how she markets her fragrance anyways. So this style of fragrance, which again, I love the opening because it speaks to me, vintage fragrance from the past, like I said. So bravo to Francesca Bianchi here. And like I said, I know I give her a hard time for her many flaws in her way of creating fragrances, in my opinion. That's what my channel's about, giving my opinion. So if you don't like it, fuck it. You know, I don't care. But I will say that I have to give her a hand for this because it feels like the little elegant, slightly feminine touches in here take the fragrance in a slightly different direction. You know, it still heavily reminds me of I love honey patchouli. If you know my taste, you know honey is one of my all-time favorite notes. So heavy patchouli, heavy honey, heavy leather, heavy animalics. I mean, this type of perfume is almost like made for me. And so even though I'm constantly reminded of my fragrances from the past, her little sort of signature bits and pieces here and there that make it lean a little more feminine, make it get pulled away from that heavy masculine side of things and make it sit more unisex in the middle. I think that that's some of the best perfumery, okay? Like perfumery, like creation for her, right? Because like I said, Under My Skin reminded me so heavy of this type of accord that I got the feeling that she studied the past and tried to kind of recreate it. But here, it really feels like she sort of created something slightly different, you know? Something unique. And I like that. Even though I must say though, this I'm gonna say I said something good about it. Now I'm gonna say something bad almost immediately because as much as I like the fragrance, my issue is that you're talking about comparing it with some of my favorite fragrances of all time to wear. So for me, it's a no-brainer. Why would I buy a bottle of this? I'll just wear this. But I think as far as like giving her props for creating something unique and different and special, those little touches that she put in there almost make this full bottle worthy for me. Almost. It's like right there. You know, I've stopped buying with the divorce, and it's gotten to the point where it's almost like buying was a little bit of a habit. And now that the habit is stopped, I don't want to start, even if it's like, oh, it's $100 here, but I don't even want to start. You know what I mean? And so plus I have a lot of fragrances to wear in case you haven't noticed. So something is going to have to absolutely blow me away or be like on my all-time wish list. Like here's a bottle of Chanel Bois Noir for $100. You know, something like that where I'm like, I can't say no to that. Right. And so, you know, those unicorn, extremely hard to find fragrances are probably the only thing that's going to really move me and get me off of the couch to buy. And this is not in that area. It's not in that realm because I would just wear my vintage masculines. I'd wear Giorgio Beverly Hills for Men or Givenchy Gentleman or something like that, right? Boss Number One, even with that heavy honey, even though it doesn't have the big patchouli there, which I've done a Hall of Fame review on that, a vintage Hall of Fame review on Boss Number One. If you're a honey lover, I would urge you to check out Hugo Boss Number One if you never have. And so I have to give her flowers for sort of creating those interesting feminine accords mixed in with the masculine trend, which this, every time I smell it, you know, I'm definitely reminded of those fragrances from the past. But again, I have to give her flowers for what she's created. But then on the other side, I would never buy this for my own personal collection because of the vast amount of vintage fragrances that I have to wear. And I much prefer to wear something like this, which is like top 10 all time for me, right? So it's almost like it's like entering the lion's den, you know what I mean? You're over the target, but you're really playing with fire when we talk about getting close to something that I would just wear one of my all-time favorites, right? But if you're someone out there who watches me and you're like, God, I can't understand Ramsey's crazy vintage obsession. I never buy a fragrance from 30 or 40 years ago. But you're like interested in maybe seeing what a vintage type Accord would be like. Sticky Fingers may not be a bad, I mean, you can get a bottle for $108 or whatever it is. You know, they're only 30 mils, but I don't think that's exorbitant. 100 and whatever that is in dollars. I think it's 108 euros, so maybe 120 or 130 bucks. Excuse me, but it's an extra. You get 30 mils, and I think it would give you an idea at least. It's a you know, how would I call it? It's an approximation of a vintage fragrance. Let's put it that way. It's not a vintage fragrance, obviously, but there are bits and pieces of this that remind me of a little bit of the past, but done in a very modern niche style. Okay, so you know, the hardcore bits and pieces that really might put some people off if you don't like vintage perfumes, I think have been very smartly toned down here. Not necessarily taken out, but toned down. It's an approximation, right, of the past. And so, but for me, I can recommend this. Now, the other problem is if you're buying it because you're a huge patchouli fan, there are a ton of patchouli fragrances in my collection that I love, which are waiting to be reviewed. One is Patchouli Antique. I think Jonathan turned me onto this, and I absolutely love this fragrance. The other one is the good old Psychedelique by Jovoy. I think Jovoy is an amazing niche house that gives great value. This is a fantastic out-and-out chocolatey patchouli. And so, you know, if you're buying it for the heavy patchouli aspect of it, that's the other problem I think that Sticky Fingers has, that there are many other patchouli fragrances, which I've shown a couple here. There's a ton more that I could discuss as well, that I still have not reviewed on the channel. So, yes, it's interesting. You know, it's an interesting. I think this is an interesting fragrance, and I think this is one of her better works. Let's put it that way. If you said, Ramsey, I want to try 2 fragrances from Francesca Bianchi that are her best work, I don't want to mess with anything else, what do you think? I'd say Under My Skin and Sticky Fingers. You know, the marketing aside, the marketing is absolutely ridiculous. You know, it's like some girl, you know, it's like some girl's lips, like she's just, you know, she's really getting ready to use those lips. Like we completely understand the marketing here, Francesca. Maybe try to be slightly a little bit more, a little more, you know, selective on how you market it. And then if you go to Parfumo and you look at the pictures with it, one of them is like, you know, Sticky Fingers under like some leather. Maybe you'd put like a ball gag in one of the pieces of you know, holes in between the leather. I don't know. Or maybe they're like supposed to hold up tights, or I don't know what that leather is for. But the marketing is absolutely ridiculous, like so over the top ridiculous to me. But for lack of anything else to really give it a hard time about, other than the fact that one thing I should mention that I think is important is that very heavy, spicy, you know, scratchy, earthy, dank patchouli opening that smells like it's from the 70s, mixing with the castoreum, mixing with the leather, does go away as the hours tick by. That may be something that you're like, huh, you know, come back. Where did you go? Because 2-3 hours in, which I have about a 3-hour dry down right here, 3 hours in, you start to get more of that sort of generic, I don't want to say generic, but you start to get more of this Accord, which is synonymous with Francesca Bianchi, okay? So if you know her other works, you know exactly the Accord I'm talking about. The one that I give her a hard time about for being lazy and overdosing in all of her fragrances, that does start to make an appearance, okay? And so the patchouli and all that stuff never truly goes away, but it tones itself down heavily from the opening. So the opening is absolutely, you know, vintage in style, but as the hours tick by, if you are someone who pays attention to what the scents do and they transition, this one transitions into something that will definitely remind you of a Francesca Bianchi scent. The opening, you know, if you blindfold someone and said, here's a fragrance from the 70s, boom, and sprayed, and they only got to smell the first 5 minutes, they may be like, yeah, this is, right, some 70s fragrance I've never smelled before. It has that hardcore vintage feel about it, but it very quickly transitions, and those heavier, harsher aspects of Givenchy Gentleman or something like that are really toned down, and then her DNA really starts to come out deeper into the dry down. Whereas, some of these vintage fragrances, which I'm just grabbing this because this is what I have here, but, this doesn't turn into that ambery sort of, heliotrope, that sort of tonka bean thing that Francesca Bianchi did with Oris, right? And so on the other side of the coin, someone may say, yeah, but this doesn't have Oris. This doesn't have Oris or Iris or, and I don't think it does anyways. So Sticky Fingers adds something a little bit more. And, you could make that case, but for me, my love for the vintages is so ingrained that, I would have a very hard time buying Sticky Fingers to wear, over some of the, I would just wear these that's one of the problems when you get a really big collection, especially if you're sort of pragmatic about it, because fragrance is made to be worn, right? And so if it's just going to sit on the shelf, what's the point, right? And so if you're pragmatic about it and you want to wear your fragrances, you eventually get to the point where you're like, why would I buy this? But objectively, for the channel, I have to say that that strong opening does transition into something else, which someone may like. I mean, there may be some of her fans that absolutely love it. Someone told me there is a fragrance that she put out as a limited edition called Sticky Lips, which came out last year. And it was supposed to be only for her. There were only 500 pieces made. 300 were said to be sold to the market or something, to her best fans, or what is that, like a Taylor Swift's, fan club or something. And then, once they were sold out, she just sold it to first come, first serve on the website or something. So I think it's sold out. But I wouldn't mind smelling Sticky Lips if it's of this DNA. And so apparently there's like an added geranium and rose note there, which is not listed, but I definitely get a little bit of a floral accord and Sticky Fingers as well. So anyways, enough rambling for a late night insight. This was supposed to just be a quick video, and here we are almost half an hour later, but that's kind of my thoughts on it. If you have experience with Sticky Fingers, I would love to hear your thoughts. It did come out in 2020, by the way, in case I didn't mention that. So do leave a comment. Thanks to everyone who always watches and comments and all that stuff. The channel is definitely growing. I'm constantly getting hit up from new people asking questions about vintages and, where do you get vintage fragrances and what do you think about this? And do you really think that Roja Dove is not the perfumer, or do you really think, those kind of questions? It's always funny to get those questions in the comments, like you've absolutely blown their mind. Olivier Creed is not the perfumer? What? It's like, but there are folks that this whole world is kind of new to them. So I'm very grateful to every single one of you who subscribes and chats with me and comments and all that stuff. It's a beautiful hobby that we have, I must admit. So thanks for watching. Let me know what your thoughts are. Cheers, guys, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.